Welcome to the Grace Totem podcast. Thank you for tuning into this episode. If you like our content, please subscribe to our channel and drop that like button. With no further delays, let us dive into our next topic with our hosts.
Welcome to the deep dive. If you've ever noticed that Protestant and Catholic Bibles don't quite line up in their Old Testament,
Yeah.
well, you've stumbled on something pretty fascinating.
It's a really interesting bit of history.
Yeah, and we're going to unpack why those differences exist. We'll trace, the key historical steps and theological ideas that led to these different versions.
Our mission really is to give you a clear picture of the main developments without getting too bogged down in super fine details.
Exactly. We want to make it understandable.
It's a question that really gets to the heart of how different Christian traditions see biblical authority. Why are there these slightly different versions of such a core text?
We hope to give you a concise but still pretty thorough overview of the crucial points.
And it's so important to remember right from the start. The Bible wasn't written in English. Not at all.
Right. We're talking ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Koine Greek.
Yeah. And that fact alone tells you that translation, it's always been a huge, complex part of the story.
Absolutely massive. The scale is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. As of, March 2025, the entire Bible exists in 771 languages.
Wow.
And parts of it are in, 3,887 languages. It just shows you how important and widespread these texts are.
Okay, so translation is key. Where does this translation story start to really impact the differences we see in the Old Testament today?
Well, some of the very first translations happened just out of sheer necessity.
Like when?
During the Babylonian exile, for instance, a lot of Jewish people started speaking Aramaic as their everyday language, and many didn't understand Hebrew anymore.
Okay. So they couldn't understand the scriptures.
Exactly. So these things called the Aramaic Targums developed. They were basically oral translations, sometimes paraphrases, of the Hebrew scriptures.
Used in the synagogues.
Right. Used right there in the synagogue so people could understand what was being read. Practical need, pure and simple.
That makes total sense. Okay, so that's Aramaic.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the Septuagint. That sounds like a really big one.
Oh, the Septuagint, yeah. Often called the LXX. That was a huge moment.
What was it exactly?
So in Alexandria, which was this major hub of Hellenistic Judaism back in the 3rd to 2nd centuries BC.
Right, in Egypt.
Yes. The Hebrew scriptures were translated into Koine Greek. This happened over time, probably finalized around, say, 132 BC.
And there's that legend about the translators, isn't there?
The legend says Ptolemy II commissioned 72 Jewish scholars. That's where the name Septuagint, meaning 70, comes from.
72 scholars, all supposedly producing identical Greek texts.
Exactly. The story found in the letter of Aristeas was meant to show its accuracy, its divine favor,
That definitely gives it some weight.
It certainly did. And this Greek translation became incredibly important. It basically became the Old Testament for the early Christian church.
Okay, but here's the crucial part for our discussion, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just a straight translation of the Hebrew text that later became standard.
Precisely. That's the key thing. The Septuagint included extra passages, even whole books, that aren't in the later standardized Hebrew text, the Masoretic text.
Where did those extra bits come from?
Well, some might have been originally written in Greek. Others could have been translations of different Hebrew versions that existed back then but haven't survived.
So it reflects a slightly different collection of texts circulating at the time.
Yes. And crucially, some of these editions had theological ideas that really resonated with the early Christians. They shaped how they understood salvation history, sometimes differently than how Rabbinic Judaism, focusing on the Masoretic text, would later develop.
So translation choices back then had real theological impact down the line.
Absolutely. Early translation wasn't just about words. It shaped understanding.
So the Old Testament, the very first Christians were reading, it already had this, let's say, expanded set of books compared to the later standard Hebrew Bible.
That's exactly right. The Septuagint was foundational for the early church's Old Testament. It heavily influenced their interpretations. It formed the basis of their canon.
And even influenced Jerome later on.
It did, even though Jerome took a pretty different path with his own big translation project.
Which brings us neatly to Jerome and the Vulgate.
Yeah.
This feels like another major turning point. Late 4th century.
It really was. Jerome, who was this incredibly respected scholar,
Right.
He kind of broke with the usual church practice. Instead of relying primarily on the Greek Septuagint for the Old Testament,
Which was the standard.
yes, he decided for most of the Old Testament in his new Latin translation, the Vulgate, to go back to the Hebrew texts available to him then.
Wow. That must have been controversial.
Oh, definitely. It wasn't just about preferring the original language. It was a whole different approach to, like, which text held the most authority.
And I bet people weren't quiet about disagreeing.
Not at all. Big names like Augustine, Jerome's contemporary, they really criticized him for it. They felt he was disrespecting the Septuagint, which was so important to the church.
But wait, he didn't just ignore the Septuagint completely, did he? Especially for those extra books.
No, that's a good point. While his big push was for Veritas Hebraica, the truth of the Hebrew text,
Right.
he did use the Greek Septuagint when translating those books we now call Deuterocanonical into his Latin Vulgate.
And he even mentioned them specifically.
He did. In what's called his helmeted preface, he listed books like Wisdom, Sirach, Judith, Tobit, Maccabees. And he said they weren't in the Hebrew canon, calling them apocryphal.
Apocryphal. You know,
Right.
like, set aside, not in the main list.
Sort of, yeah, though the term itself just means hidden, but it wasn't a complete dismissal even then.
Because I thought he actually translated some of them himself.
You're right. Despite his own views on their canonical status, bishops asked him to translate Tobit and Judith, and he did, from Hebrew or Aramaic versions he found. And he also acknowledged that the church used the Deuterocanonical editions in the book of Daniel, so it was complex, even for Jerome.
So even with Jerome pushing for the Hebrew, these other books were still kind of present. They were in the Vulgate.
They were included in the Vulgate manuscript tradition, yes. And eventually, Jerome's Vulgate became the standard Latin Bible in the West, gradually replacing older Latin versions that were based solely on the Septuagint.
Okay, so moving into the medieval period,
Yeah.
Latin and the Vulgate are dominant in the Western Church, right?
Absolutely. For centuries, Latin was the language of liturgy, scholarship. The Vulgate was the text.
Did the question about these extra books just sort of fade away?
Not entirely, but the sharp distinction maybe wasn't always at the forefront. These books were part of the Vulgate people used. They showed up in medieval art, in theological writings, in prayers.
Right, but vernacular translations started appearing too, didn't they? Translations into everyday languages.
They did, gradually, often based on the Vulgate, not directly from Hebrew or Greek. And frequently, especially before printing, they were shared orally. Think of early Old English translations by figures like Bede or Alfred the Great, or versions in Old High German, Old Church Slavonic.
So efforts to make scriptures accessible were happening even if Latin was primary for the church officially.
Exactly. It shows a desire for wider access, even if the model of personal Bible study wasn't the same as what emerged later in Protestantism.
Which leads us to the Reformation. This seems to be where the paths really diverge sharply regarding the Old Testament canon.
Yes, this is the crucial period for that divergence. There's this renewed surge of interest in going back to the original sources ad fontes.
Back to the Hebrew and Greek.
Right. Driven partly by humanist scholars like Erasmus. His publication of a critical Greek New Testament was a massive catalyst. Translators started using that instead of just the Latin Vulgate.
And Martin Luther's German Bible was obviously huge here.
Immensely influential. Luther used Erasmus's Greek for the New Testament, and for the Old Testament, he looked closely at the Hebrew.
And what was his take on those books that were in the Septuagint, but not the Hebrew canon?
He viewed them differently. He called them the Apocrypha books that were, in his view, not held equal to the sacred scriptures and yet are useful and good for reading.
So not scripture in the same way, but still valuable.
That was his position. And importantly, he didn't just throw them out. He included them in his German Bible, but grouped them together in a separate section between the Old and New Testaments.
He had some reservations about New Testament books too, right?
He did, yes. Books like Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation, he called them the antilegomena, meaning spoken against, placing them at the end. So questioning canon wasn't unique to the Old Testament for him.
And this practice of including the Apocrypha in a separate section that carried over into early English Protestant Bibles.
It did. If you look at Tyndale's translation efforts, Coverdale's Bible, the Geneva Bible, even the original 1611 King James Version, they all contain the Apocrypha, usually in that separate section.
So the immediate break wasn't about removing them entirely, but
Yeah.
about their status.
Exactly. The real hardening of the lines came with the core principles of the Reformation, especially sola scriptura, scripture alone.
Explain that contrast again.
Well, for Protestants emphasizing sola scriptura, the Bible is the sole, ultimate source of infallible authority for faith and practice.
Okay.
Whereas the Catholic Church holds that authority rests in both sacred scripture and sacred tradition, with the magisterium, the teaching office of the Pope, and bishops having the authority to interpret both.
So, two different views on where final authority lies.
Mm.
And that impacts the view of the canon.
Fundamentally, because the Catholic Church looked at the long-standing tradition, going back to the Septuagint and the early church's usage, as part of the evidence for including those books.
And they made a formal decision on this during the Reformation.
Yes, at the Council of Trent in 1546. It was partly a response to Protestant challenges. The council formally defined the Catholic biblical canon, explicitly affirming those books, the Deuterocanonicals, as fully part of the Old Testament.
Let's clarify the terms again. Deuterocanonical versus apocryphal.
Right. Deuterocanonical is the term preferred by Catholics and Orthodox. It means second canon, referring to the timing of their formal recognition, not suggesting lesser importance.
Okay.
Apocrypha, meaning hidden, is the term often used by Protestants. Sometimes it just means not in the Hebrew canon, but it can carry a sense of being less authoritative or even spurious, although historically they weren't really hidden.
And just to be clear, the books the Council of Trent affirmed are
Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, also called Ecclesiasticus,
Yeah.
Baruch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, plus some additions to the books of Esther and Daniel.
And these are definitively part of the Catholic Old Testament, considered inspired scripture.
Absolutely. Fully canonical, fully inspired within the Catholic tradition. And this matters doctrinally, too. Well, certain Catholic doctrines find significant scriptural support in these books. The most cited example is probably the practice of praying for the dead and the concept of purgatory, which draws support from passages in 2 Maccabees.
Right. And the main Protestant argument for not including them.
It largely goes back to the Hebrew canon. The argument is that the Jewish canon, understood to be finalized somewhere around the end of the 1st century AD, did not include these books. So following the principle of Veritas Hebraica and Sola Scriptura, many Protestants adhere to that shorter canon for the Old Testament.
Some also raise doctrinal points.
Yes, some Protestant theologians argue that certain teachings within the Deuterocanonical books conflict with doctrines found elsewhere in Scripture.
But it's interesting, you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls earlier.
Ah, yes. A fascinating wrinkle. The scrolls, dating from before and during the time of Jesus, contain fragments of some of these disputed books, like Sirach and Tobit, written in Hebrew or Aramaic.
So they were definitely around and being read in Jewish circles back then.
It certainly shows they were part of the Jewish literary world during the Second Temple period, even if their exact canonical status within Judaism itself was perhaps still developing or debated in different communities.
And later on, there were more practical reasons why they disappeared from many Protestant Bibles.
There were. Especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, economics played a role. Bible societies aiming for wide, cheap distribution found it less expensive to print Bibles without the Apocrypha section.
Cheaper books meant wider reach.
Exactly. So cost-cutting contributed to the Apocrypha becoming less common in Protestant editions, reinforcing their marginalization in those traditions.
Okay, so let's try to sum this up. The key difference in the Old Testament between most Protestant Bibles and Catholic Bibles is the Catholic inclusion of the Deuterocanonical books
Based on their presence in the Septuagint and the tradition of the early church,
versus their general exclusion by Protestants.
who tend to follow the Hebrew canon and the principle of sola scriptura, and the books accepted by everyone are sometimes called proto-canonical.
First canon.
Right. It's a good summary. And it's really crucial to get that these aren't just like minor quibbles over footnotes. The defined canon of Scripture carries real theological weight in each tradition. It shapes doctrine, practice, understanding.
It's clearly a really long, complex story. It involves languages, history, theology, church politics, centuries of development.
Absolutely. It really underscores that the Bible, its transmission, its interpretation, it hasn't been some static thing dropped from the sky. It has a history.
And maybe, for you listening, one of the best ways to get a feel for this is actually to, well, read some of those Deuterocanonical books.
That's a fantastic idea. Reading Tobit or Wisdom or Maccabees gives you a direct sense of the texts themselves and why they've been part of these conversations for so long.
Definitely something to consider. And it leaves us with a final thought, perhaps.
Yeah.
How does understanding this whole historical journey, the different paths taken in defining the canon, how does that shape how you, personally, approach Scripture? How does it help you understand the different ways Christians read these texts today?
That's a great question to ponder. It definitely invites a deeper appreciation for the richness and sometimes the complexity of biblical history.
And here wraps the episode of the Grace Totem podcast. If you've liked the content, please make sure you drop that like button. Stay tuned with us as we deep dive into the topics, unpacking and unraveling them by subscribing to our channel and clicking on the bell icon so that you get notified when we post new content. Thank you for listening to us. See you soon.